it was all Jews had to be deported. All Jews had to get out of Austria. And as I was reading the descriptions of Jews having to pack and the police searching houses for Jews to ensure that they leave Austria within the deadline, within the time limit, this was while California was going on. This was while LA was going on, and when ICE were picking up undocumented workers in factories and farms. And it was so uncannily similar. I thought this book is really quite a remarkable book in many ways. But at the time, when Bettauer, that's the author, wrote this book, he was assassinated 3 years later by an Austrian Nazi. When he wrote this book, nobody knew where this was all heading. And where this was heading was the Holocaust. The difference between then and now is all these phenomena that we're witnessing now, we witnessed in the 1920s and the 1930s. Not as precise, they're not precise analogies, but the phenomena are very similar. Only this time, we do actually know where this might lead.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. Today, I am really happy to be speaking to Misha Glenny. Misha made a name for himself as the BBC's Central Europe correspondent, covering the 1989 revolutions and the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Ethnic cleansing and brutal conflict weren't quite enough for him, so he later began reporting on organized crime, from money laundering to people smuggling to the drugs and sex trades and cybercrime. His books include The Rebirth of History, Eastern Europe in the Age of Democracy, The Fall of Yugoslavia, the Third Balkan War, Cyber Thieves, Cyber Cops, and You, and Nemesis, One Man and the Battle for Rio. And of course, there's McMafia, a journey through the global criminal underworld, which has become quite famous because it's been turned into an amazing high-end TV series, now I think in its second season. Misha's taught at prestigious universities around the world and is regularly consulted by governments and law enforcement agencies in Europe and the Americas on the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And he still writes regularly for major publications in Europe, North America, and Japan. All in all, a man who deeply understands the dark side of humanity and therefore the perfect guest for this podcast. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Misha.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Misha, I'm going to do something really unspeakable to you here. I'd like to ask you to describe what happened to Yugoslavia after 1990. But first, let me try and set it up properly and do a ridiculous thing and summarizing a couple of thousand years of history in a minute. From the medieval period, there were various small countries and city-states that controlled parts of what became Yugoslavia. Many of these small political entities were absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled from what is now Istanbul, and then some of them into the Central European Habsburg Empire. Then there were a couple of 100 years of fighting, regional wars, independence movements, changing borders, and so forth, until in 1918, a state known as Yugoslavia or South Slavia emerged, uniting Slavs, Bosnians, Croats, Macedonians, Montenegrins, Serbs, and a few other peoples in one united kingdom, and from 1945 as a socialist federal republic comprising 6 constituent republics: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. Within Serbia were the 2 socialist autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina. Sounds in some ways a little like the United States, and it worked swimmingly until the end of the Cold War, I think. Is that about right, Misha? And if it is, what happened next?
Yeah, thanks very much for that introduction. I wouldn't say that it always worked swimmingly. There were always tensions, particularly between Serbs and Croats, who made up the bulk of the population, the 2 largest ethnic groups, who were also, of course, defined by religion. The Croats were largely Catholic, the Serbs were largely Eastern Orthodox, and of course, the Bosniaks were largely Muslim, although you had large Serbian and Croatian populations in Bosnia as well. What happened is that as communism collapsed throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, there were attempts to transform Yugoslavia from a one-party system into a democratic system, but the centrifugal or centripetal tendencies of nationalism proved too much of a strain. And because the populations were all mixed up, particularly in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then in Serbia with Kosovo and Vojvodina. This meant that the transition to democracy collapsed into a civil war. Now, things don't collapse into civil war just like that. There are people who were encouraging the violent collapse of the state. And one of the reasons why they were doing this, and this is really the background to what was happening in Yugoslavia and why it's important to understand in terms of what's been happening since then, is that various actors, the leaders, the new elites, the old elites, were rapidly privatizing the state assets. And because this was a communist state, even though it was independent of the Soviet Union and not in the Warsaw Pact, there were a lot of public assets, state assets, which were under the cover of war, whether you were in Serbia or Croatia or in Bosnia-Herzegovina or Slovenia, wherever you were, these were put into private hands, and you saw the rapid emergence of an oligarchic system, an oligarchy which collaborated with the remnants of the Communist Party in each republic, with the secret police, intelligence services, and with organized crime was mobilized by all the states that emerged out of the former Yugoslavia as a way of furthering their aims. Serbia dominated this because they were the largest population, and they had these two large minority populations in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And eventually it fragmented into a variety of different states. So it was very complicated, pretty bloody, and it was regarded at the time as the sort of detritus, the leftover of communism, and that it was an anachronism. In fact, you can look at it now and see that in many ways, some of the practices that emerged during the Yugoslav war, particularly with the strongmen, Slobodan Milošević in Serbia and Franjo Tudjman in Croatia, they were actually beginning to experiment with the type of policies, the weaponization of nationalism, for example, and the encouragement of an oligarchic and criminal structure. These are the processes that actually then became popular in many other parts of the world, including, one might argue, the United States, over the next 30 to 35 years. It was a great tragedy anyhow, but it's also a very important case study in terms of understanding the processes that we've been living through since 1989.
So the figure from the Balkan War that I found myself most drawn to right now is Slobodan Milošević. And he makes me recall a certain other orange-hued strongman who rules over a federal government in a fractious land. What should we know about Slobodan Milošević?
Well, I think the most important thing about Milošević is that he wasn't really anyone. He was a quite efficient party bureaucrat up until the mid-1980s. And there are two key figures in his life. One is his wife, Mira Marković, who he met when he was 16 at school, and they started going out together then, and then they married and were inseparable. And she had ambition enough for both of them. She really drove him on in terms of his political career. But his political career wouldn't have got anywhere were it not for a man who he met at university called Ivan Stambolić, who wherever Stambolić went in terms of his political or his positions in various businesses, he would appoint Milošević to come after him. And Stambolić, who I knew, I also knew Milošević as well, Stambolić was actually a very decent guy who was extremely worried about nationalism in the 1980s, as you were beginning to feel it all over Yugoslavia. And Mira Marković persuaded Slobodan Milošević to break with Ivan Stambolić in 1987. And this was a dramatic Shakespearean moment, which took place on live television. And Milošević flipped from being a relatively reasonable, studied party bureaucrat into a rabble-rousing nationalist, pushed by Mira Marković, his wife. And Stambolic was a broken man. Stambolic was eventually murdered, almost certainly at the behest of Milošević and Mira Marković, but this was a lot later. This was over 10 years later.
When you say it happened on live TV, what exactly happened?
So it was a meeting of the Serbian League of Communists Central Committee. And basically, Ivan Stambolic was trying to have a consensual approach to the problem of Kosovo. And Milošević used the issue of Kosovo to turn the Central Committee, the majority of the Central Committee, against Stambolic, the man to whom he owed his entire career. And you can see it if you look at it when Milošević is giving his speech and suddenly departing from the agreed line that he had with Stambolic. You can see on Stambolic's face that suddenly this man who had been working with for almost 30 years and who was his closest political confidant was plunging the political knife into his back. So they murdered Stambolic twice. They murdered him politically in 1987, and he was out of the game. And Milošević then became rapidly ascended to being the dictator in Serbia. And then they murdered him literally about 13 years later, that he was literally murdered, almost certainly at the behest of Milošević and his wife, Mira Marković. Marković in particular, who really detested Ivan Stambolic.
She was really a Lady Macbeth kind of figure.
She was a Lady Macbeth. I'm always a little concerned about perhaps characterizing a sort of misogynist relationship, but Mira Marković was truly ambitious and unpleasant. And I say this having spoken to people who knew her entire life, including a number of women as well. It was a consensus. They all agreed that she was simply a really, really nasty piece of work.
Some of the videos I've seen of Milošević giving speeches that are online, you can see her standing behind him with a kind of steely-eyed look on her face.
She was steely-eyed, yeah.
Right.
It was quite a weird thing because she had a column in a news magazine once a week, and everyone read this column with huge intensity to try and understand whether it was revealing something about Milosevic's plans or Milosevic's character. There was one particular one where she wrote in the third person about a family being broken up because the father had had an affair. And there was endless speculation about whether Slobodan was sleeping with someone else at this time. But after about sort of 3 or 4 weeks, that debate petered out. But what it did do was to often distract people from what was really going on in Serbia, which, as I say, was a very efficient economic revolution of privatizing assets and turning the place into a capitalist dictatorship where it had previously been a socialist dictatorship.
I want to get back to that a little bit more, but just a last question about Milošević himself as a person. These videos that I looked at of him giving speeches, he doesn't come off as very charismatic.
He's not.
I mean, he seems sort of like a slightly second-rate, second-hand car salesman or something. How do you think he managed to get so many people behind him? And to the point where I've seen, after his death, there are photos you can find on the internet of like old women touching his face, a statue of him touching his face or kissing it. And he seemed to have inspired incredible loyalty for somebody who seems so unprepossessing.
Yeah, so it's interesting this because he is particularly compared to figures like Trump, Orban and Putin and so on. He was pretty unprepossessing. He had a kind of cold gaze, which was quite intimidating and frightening. And he had a kind of haughty distance, which apparently appealed to some people. But the key thing is that he touched on a large number of unresolved issues of national identity and perceived discrimination against Serbs, combined with the fact that he controlled Radio Television Serbia, and most people still received all of their news from television news. and combining the fact that he controlled all the main levers of state. So he was able to dispense money and favors to all the key economic and political instances inside the country. I mean, there's one thing that one has to remember about people like Orban and people like Putin, and Milošević certainly did this, is that they do control things. They do not brook dissent. They do not brook opposition. The one intelligent thing about Milošević was that he didn't close down all the media. If you wanted to, you could read liberal newspapers and liberal magazines, and there were some very good radio stations in particular, but most of these, what he did was he controlled the distributions of those magazines and newspapers so that they were very readily available inside Belgrade, which was an anti-Milošević liberal hub, as most cities are. Moscow is really the center of opposition such as it now exists to Putin. Budapest is very hostile to Orban. Brexit was a complete non-starter in London. And New York and Los Angeles, of course, are hostile to Trump on the whole. So he allowed access to information from people in Belgrade, but people in the countryside and people in the smaller towns, he was really controlling what they were thinking. And because of the history of the Second World War in particular, when Serbs were subject to massacres both by the fascist Croat state and by the Nazis, and to some extent there was a Muslim SS unit in Bosnia-Herzegovina, he was able to play on this memory and fear of slaughter during the Second World War in order to present Serbia as once again being threatened by both domestic, by neighbors like the Croats, and by external actors like Germany. And Germany's support for Croatian independence, political support for Croatian independence during this period when Yugoslavia was breaking up, which was very important to Croatia and very important politically in general. Milošević was able to exploit that systematically to say that once again the Germans and the Croats are ganging up and they're determined to try and once again exercise their genocidal politics over Serbs and Serbia. And for those Serbs who lived inside Croatia, there were genuine fears about Franjo Tudjman and his regime in Croatia, which readily used the symbolism of the Second World War, of one of the nastiest fascist states in Europe, the NDH. And there was almost a sort of symbiotic relationship between Tudjman and Milošević. We know that they sat down together and wanted to carve up Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example. So although on the one hand, Milošević and Tudjman were engaged in a war with each other, there was also lots of evidence that these two were collaborating in the carve-up of the former Yugoslavia. So while Milošević did not project that charisma that we now have come to associate with a lot of the authoritarian and autocratic leaders, what he did do was to identify at an early stage all the mechanisms and institutions that he needed to control in order to ensure a broad base of support within Serbia. But remember, like all of these places, it involves control over the media, control over things like customs and excise, things like that, so you can make a lot of money. Democratic institutions do not work or work only very partially in these situations. And that was the case with Milošević.
Can you talk a little bit about the scapegoating or the targeting of Muslims? Because you've mentioned the fear of the Croats, but then there's this whole other piece.
So the thing about the former Yugoslavia, which makes it special, is that it was in the 19th century strategically very valuable because it controlled access from Northern Europe and in particular from Germany to the oil fields of the Middle East. You had to go through the Balkans, and the Balkans is a very mountainous areas. So it's really critical to control the sort of main passes through the main roads through those mountains. And it was where three religions and three imperial aspirations met. So you had Islam, you had Eastern Orthodoxy, and you had Catholicism. And of course, you had a Jewish population in all of the cities of the former Yugoslavia as well, who suffered immensely at the hands of the fascist regime, the NDH, during the Second World War. So those three religious communities all come together. They meet in the Balkans, combined with its strategic importance and the fact that the Russian Empire would attempt to assert influence over Serbs and Bulgarians, who are also Eastern Orthodox. It meant that this was the apple of discord as imperialism in Europe started to move towards a major conflict. And of course, it begins in Sarajevo, in the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, in 1914. And so that's why the Balkans is referred to as the powder keg of Europe. But in fact, the powder keg was not Europe, was not the Balkans. The powder keg was Europe itself. The Balkans was merely the fuse which lit the powder keg of European imperial competition. Now, the reason why you have significant Muslim populations in Europe is because they either converted or they moved there during the 500 years or so of Ottoman control of southeastern Europe, of Muslim control. Actually, until the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was relatively liberal and accommodating to its religious minorities, as long as you were a religion recognized as people of the book, as it was called, i.e. if you were either Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, you were able to have your own community, your own courts, your churches. There was a social hierarchy in which Muslims were at the top, but often you would find converted Christians or converted Jews having extremely influential positions inside the Ottoman hierarchy. It's only when the Ottoman Empire starts to collapse and weaken in the 19th century that the place becomes violent. And you get massacres and counter-massacres between Muslims and Greeks who are Orthodox Christians, Muslims and Bulgarians who are Orthodox Christians. And most of the Albanian population has also converted. About 70% has converted to Islam. So you have a Muslim population there. You have a patchwork of these religions all over the former Yugoslavia. And that's why when external forces of the great empires, the Russian Empire, the German or the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman Empire, and of course the British and the French empires, who are also interested strategically in the Balkans and the Mediterranean, when they start to argue and they exploit their proxies on the ground, it leads to an immense amount of bloodshed, which is what happens during the First World War and during the Second World War.
One last question about Muslims then. Am I right that at one point Milošević was using the kind of rhetoric about Muslims that they should go home to Turkey, like go home to the Ottoman Empire where they came from?
Milošević didn't do that. Tudjman was much more explicit in his anti-Islamic statements, the Croatian leader, and he did want to portray himself rather in the vein of Viktor Orban as being the protector of Christendom and particularly Catholicism and Western Christendom, the protector against the Muslim invasion. Tudjman would often be surprised when he received criticism from Western media or Western politicians that he engaged in a war against the Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the thing you have to remember about Milošević, Tudjman really was a Croatian nationalist. Milošević was an opportunist. His contempt for Muslims and Croats was actually not that different for his contempt for Serbs as well. He didn't have a passionate historical mission the way that Tudjman did. He was interested in power and sustaining his power and sustaining his influence and money, which is why he was prepared to do a deal in the end over Bosnia-Herzegovina with the West. And he thought he'd got away with it, but he hadn't.
Right. I've been reading about the mayoral candidate for New York, Zoran Mamdani, and there are these, various Republicans calling for him to go home.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've been reading quite a lot about Austrian history from 1867 to 1945, part first as the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then as Austria, the First Republic. And what's interesting is that in newspapers and books at the time, it was perfectly acceptable to write the most hideous racist diatribes against whoever your enemy happened to be. Usually in the case of the German-Austrian nationalists, it was the Jews, but it was also the Czechs, it was also the Hungarians, it was also the Slovaks and the Croats and Serbs and so on. And it's the type of language that you will see used now over social media in the United States and elsewhere. The language is almost identical, with basically people feel through social media as they're liberated to say anything that is actually unacceptable because it's racist and discriminatory, because they feel as though they're doing it in the name of free speech or whatever it is that they justify it with. But the language is really, really similar. So one of the things that I think that we're witnessing and experiencing at the moment is the chaos and the confusion, certainly in Europe, but to some extent the United States as well, that was generated by the 1920s, successive economic crises, a lot of political crises. And there emerged out of that a really hysterical political vocabulary. And I read a book the other week, quite astonishing, called The City Without Jews, which was written by a Jewish author in 1922, about how the new Austrian Republic, this is fictional, the fictional prime minister passed legislation saying that all Jews had to leave Austria. And anti-Semitism was rife in Austria, so it was a credible thing. But the fact that it was written in 1922 was absolutely astonishing. And as I was reading it, the law that passed was not genocidal in as much that it was not saying that all Jews should be killed. It was all Jews had to be deported. All Jews had to get out of Austria. And as I was reading the descriptions of Jews having to pack and the police searching houses for Jews to ensure that they leave Austria within the deadline, within the time limit. This was while California was going on. This was while LA was going on, and when ICE were picking up undocumented workers in factories and farms. And it was so uncannily similar. I thought this book is really quite a remarkable book in many ways. But at the time, when Bettauer, that's the author, wrote this book, he was assassinated 3 years later by an Austrian Nazi. When he wrote this book, nobody knew where this was all heading. And where this was heading was the Holocaust. The difference between then and now is all these phenomena that we're witnessing now, we witnessed in the 1920s and the 1930s. They're not precise analogies, but the phenomena are very similar. Only this time, we do actually know where this might lead. And yet, nonetheless, we sit back and we allow this all to happen. We haven't seen the consequences previously of climate change, but we have a pretty good idea where climate change might lead now as well. And yet, all of these phenomena seem to be growing, seem to be expanding. And those people who have that historical memory and who are aware of where this might lead, we all appear to be pretty powerless and pretty clueless about what we do about it, even though we're watching it happen in real time.
Yeah, that really strikes a note with me because, I lived in China for 20 years. And for a long time, I used to think, how could these very reasonable people around me have done the great leap forward? How could they have believed that if you melt down all your pots, you can exceed the steel production of the US? How could they do the Cultural Revolution? How could they follow Mao Zedong into this thing? How could Germans, decent Germans, have followed Hitler? And now I don't ask that question anymore. So maybe there's a little bit of positivity. I mean, the Balkans now are largely peaceful, aren't they? Is that correct? And I mean, what do you think accounts for the peace after the war?
Well, first of all, they are largely peaceful. There are still 2 or 3 important constitutional issues which have yet to be resolved. And it's very difficult for them to move forward until those are resolved. It was partly through exhaustion, partly because in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there was finally, and to an extent in Kosovo as well, there was finally a consensus amongst the great external powers that they needed to collaborate on bringing this to an end. It was much, much easier in the 1990s to negotiate this because Russia at the time, under Gorbachev, was basically writing blank checks to the West. This was the period when America was known as the sole remaining superpower. And really, there was no challenge to American power. The Americans persuaded the Russians to go along with their solution for Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was an ambitious and decent attempt at a solution. Really, what the solution in Bosnia was it was a grandiose ceasefire. It's a grandiose ceasefire which has lasted since 1995, and so hats off to everyone involved. But it hasn't really resulted in a functioning modern state. It is a fragmented state politically, economically, and socially. It suffers from a chronic loss of people. This is something which all of the Balkans and Eastern Europe has suffered. Really huge emigration because the local economies don't offer enough and because a lot of European states are happy to absorb migrants from Southeastern Europe. And also, interestingly enough, particularly from Macedonia, Serbia, and Croatia, you have the advantage of what was a good education system in which to some extent has survived. So you'll find a lot of people from Southeastern Europe working at places like Microsoft or doing their own startups. They're very good at science and computers in the region, rather like the Russians and Ukrainians as well. So Bulgarians, Romanians, they're good hackers, they're good startup people, but a lot of them just leave the region. So it suffers from a labor shortage. Serbia itself is going through huge turmoil at the moment with the autocrat Aleksandar Vučić coming under huge popular pressure. But what it really needs in order to be able to calm down is we need to absorb them into the European Union. I'm British, so I'm no longer a member of the European Union by dint of my Britishness, but I also, thanks to the foresight of my paternal grandfather who was born in Newry County Down in Northern Ireland, I'm also an Irish citizen, so I remain as European as everyone else. And for a long time I have known, and I am committed to promoting the membership of the former Yugoslav states and Albania in the European Union, because that will settle things down a lot. If you have a supranational organization like the European Union, then the importance of your particular passport becomes less relevant. So, for example, one of the reasons why the United Kingdom and Ireland were able to come to an agreement with the various political forces in Northern Ireland was because everyone was a member of the European Union. And so the importance of holding a British over an Irish passport really wasn't that great, and why Brexit, amongst other things, has had a very negative effect on the long-term stability of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. Misha, you've done an extraordinary job. I mean, I asked you to basically explain one of the most complicated places on earth in a tiny amount of time, and it's pretty incredible. And I could talk to you about the Balkans for another 10 hours, but I'm mindful of time. So I'd like to ask a little bit about organized crime. And when I first started learning about your work, I thought, well, that's a little odd. You know, he was a Yugoslavia guy and then now he's a mafia guy. And until I started actually reading what you've been writing, and the two topics are quite closely or very closely connected. So could I ask you to explain the concept of McMafia and how that rose out of the end of the Cold War?
Yeah. So basically, you had two very powerful economic and social phenomena happening at the same time in the 1990s. The first was it's not chronologically the first, but the most obvious was the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist states in Eastern Europe, you also had temporarily a partial, or in some cases, a total collapse of the state and state functions. So simultaneous with the emergence of a market economy. Now, for a market economy to function, you need to have a way of regulating it. You need to have a way of ensuring the validity and the trustworthiness of contracts. And if you don't have a legal and policing system to do that, one emerges spontaneously, just as it did in Italy in the 1850s and 1860s, particularly in Sicily. That is, instead of having a police force to say to businessman one, you've got to pay up to businessman two because he's delivered the goods to you, because there were no police forces or court jurisdictions able to manage that, instead, each person got their own police force, which were referred to and are still referred to by sociologists as privatized law enforcement agencies, but we know them more colloquially as the mafia, who would ensure the sanctity of contracts. So what mafia originally means is not people who are dealing drugs. What they're doing is they are regulating the market. And because they are private law enforcement agencies, there is no morality about which markets they are regulating. They might regulate food and furniture, but they also might regulate drugs or untaxed cigarettes or women being trafficked for sexual purposes. So you had the emergence of capitalism in Eastern Europe was inextricably linked with the emergence of very powerful organized crime groups, who, of course, very quickly also not only satisfied themselves with regulating these new businesses that were springing up, what we would call illicit and licit, but they also became involved in the game themselves as actors. Now, at the same time, this led to a phenomenal capital accumulation for a small number of people in Eastern Europe, the so-called oligarchs, similar as to what was happening in Yugoslavia. And this happened on a grand scale in the former Soviet Union. Now, at the same time, what was happening was that the full impact of the neoliberal reforms undertaken during the Reagan and Thatcher period in particular were beginning to have their effect, where capital was moving around the world at much greater speed and with many fewer controls on it than before. Ditto with goods as well. And intrinsic to this spread of the growth of finance capital around the world were jurisdictions where people didn't have to pay tax and where no questions were asked about the origins of money. These are tax havens and places like the Cayman Islands and so on and so forth. So the organized crime groups, who had become the sort of an integral factor in the emergent market economies in Eastern Europe, they realized what was going on with all these money flows that neoliberalism had triggered. And so they joined companies like Enron in laundering their money around the world and shifting it around. And you started to get new patterns of trade where trade had not existed before, and an internationalization of organized criminal markets. And the nature of the mafia changed. They stopped being largely clan-based, and they started to become transaction-based. So they were much more opportunistic, much quicker when it came to responding to new market opportunities, and so on and so forth. So what the mafia was about, really, was how the combination of neoliberalism and the collapse of communism and the emergence of capitalism in Eastern Europe and everywhere from Slovenia to the Chinese border led to a dramatic increase in criminalization of parts of the world economy. Mafia 1 came out in late 2007, early 2008. If I were to do a Mafia 2 now, which I won't because it involves traveling around the world and I'm too old, sick, tired and stupid to do that anymore. But if I were, then It would be about how organized crime and oligarchy identified the ways in which you could effect state capture. And we are seeing that state capture take place everywhere around the world now. Wherever you look, there is state capture either being attempted or having succeeded. And they'll use all sorts of methods, most notably populism and nationalism, in order to ensure that that takes place. But we also have a new phenomenon, which is the massive accumulation of capital and influence in Silicon Valley, for want of a better word, by the tech bros, the oligarchy. This is a new phenomenon, and it is their attempt to assert a new world order, which is perhaps best articulated by Peter Thiel, I would say. A new world order in which nation states themselves actually become less important, although that transitional phase would be very difficult and very violent. And one could argue that we're already in that.
What did the internet do to organized crime?
Well, this is very important because during the 1990s and the early 2000s, organized criminal groups, traditional organized crime groups, mafia, didn't have that much engagement with the internet. They didn't understand it. They thought it was complicated, technical, and they preferred the old ways. There were one or two groups we saw, notably in Colombia, which started using the internet in order to make their businesses more efficient. Quite simply monitoring their stock, their inventory, where it was going, who was buying and selling that. We saw that with one or two of the cartels in Colombia. We saw it especially in the rise of the PCC, the largest organized crime group possibly in the world, based initially in São Paulo, but it's now spread all over South America. But you then had a discrete community emerge, largely in the former Soviet Union, but not exclusively. You also saw it in Brazil, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, of hackers, of people who understood that as commerce moved over onto the internet, there was very little security, and they started trading extremely successfully in carding, in credit cards, cloned debit cards and credit cards. And these spawned the early websites like Dark Market, Shadow Crew, and so on, where people could buy and sell stuff. The most famous one came a little later. That was Silk Road and Silk Road 2. And then what you saw happening as the profits from cybercrime started to become really quite significant in the first decade of this century, you started to see, and also you saw, the members of organized crime groups who were growing up and who were digital natives start to get into positions of leadership inside organized crime groups. You started to see a merging of techniques in crime between the traditional organized crime groups and the cyber criminal groups. The cyber criminal groups became more professional and more organized along traditional organized crime lines, i.e. the so-called script kiddies, the lone wolves, the original pioneers of cybercrime, were soon absorbed into more organized cyber criminal groups where you would have someone who organizes the whole operation of, say, hacking a website, someone who would do the coding and create the malware, someone who would deploy the malware through social engineering, phishing techniques, and so on, then people who would exfiltrate the data, and then people who would monetize it, and people who would act as money mules to launder the proceeds of the crime. So this became more and more professional. And as this happened, as so much trade started going over on the internet, and as the internet grew in scale in a way that we can barely comprehend with our human brains, the profits of cybercrime started to outstrip those of traditional organized crime. And cybercrime is now worth annually something in the region of $9.5 trillion, whereas traditional organized crime is somewhere between $2.5 and $3 trillion, depending on how you calculate it. So cybercrime now outstrips traditional organized crime by some measure. If it were a country, its GDP will be the third largest country in the world after the US and China. And now that they have discovered how to break into, or they occasionally succeed in breaking into cryptocurrency exchanges, we are seeing crimes where not millions, not tens, not hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars will be lost. The largest one took place in February earlier this year, Bybit, which lost $1.4 billion in a space of about 45 minutes after a successful hack into its system. So these are huge, huge figures now. States have understood the value of this, and we've seen in Russia, we know in North Korea as well, that organized crime groups or cybercrime groups and the state collaborate opportunistically. In the case of North Korea, everything is directed by the state. The way I sum up the world these days is we're not in Kansas anymore, and there's no way of getting back to Kansas either. And where we stand is on the brink of a shift in technological developments on a scale that we've never experienced before. So we've had these huge disruptions because of technology before, but what we have not had is technology which advances so quickly with such serious social impacts that we cannot absorb and comprehend and understand what is happening ourselves. And obviously, we're now with artificial intelligence on the verge of something. I mean, all you have to do is to go onto YouTube now and realize that probably 90% of the shit that's on YouTube is just that. It's AI generating. You have no idea what is the truth and what's not the truth. So that's become an entirely sort of almost on social media, almost a redundant concept.
Can I step back a bit about cryptocurrency? Because you talked about the theft of cryptocurrency. But aside from just stealing it, how is crypto used by criminal groups? And this sort of brings me back to Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's important to say that most cryptocurrency is not involved in specific criminal transactions, but most criminal transactions on the web use cryptocurrency. But what has happened since Trump was re-elected, really since November of last year, is that cryptos have come back in favor. And this is where you see the influence of libertarianism on trying to remove the financial flows of the world from any control of the state, and why you saw that huge surge in Bitcoin last year, even before Trump was elected. And once he came in, he has exploited cryptocurrency himself for the scams of the memes and so on, the meme coins and everything. I mean, it's just so transparent. Frankly, a lot of crypto works on the fact that there's one born every minute. If you are stupid enough to invest in Trump's meme coins, then you got to be prepared to lose your money. It's as simple as that. Some people know what they're doing with cryptocurrencies. Most people don't understand what's going on. Most of it is now moving into huge financial institutions because they can see which way Trump is going to go, and Trump is absolutely critical for this. And so what you're seeing in the fluctuations, say Bitcoin moves between, let's say, about 88,000 and 108,000. This is all to do with which financial institutions are buying Bitcoin in bulk, which are getting rid of Bitcoin. It's now also very closely tied to the economic performance of the United States. You see the value of Bitcoin. If Wall Street goes down, Bitcoin tends to go down as well. So although cryptocurrencies are very important for criminal transactions on the web, their significance now is of a different measure, in my opinion. And it's the criminal aspect to them is one part of it, but it's not the decisive part.
Misha, we've covered a huge range of topics. Thank you for your tolerance of my very divergent bunch of questions. I'd like to ask one final question. You mentioned the book A City Without Jews, which was written in 1922. And I have been having this feeling for the whole year that we are kind of in the 20s again in a different form. And as I think you mentioned, I mean, I feel helpless and impotent. And I feel as though if only we could warn people in the 1920s and what was coming, couldn't they have done something differently? And I find myself thinking, well, what do we do now? So having studied human darkness for much of your career, do you have any advice for Americans, at least, facing the current political moment?
Well, first of all, the circumstances in the 20s and 30s, you had an existential threat to a much larger part of the population than you do now, i.e. people were starving in all major European cities. Hundreds of thousands and millions across Europe were homeless at the time. And things were worse than they are now. But it's, of course, always relative. What you saw then, which is what you've seen now emerge over the past 30, 35 years, is the rise in income inequality and the very real perception by many parts of society that they have been screwed over by whatever has been going on over the past 30 or 40 years. So in that sense, what it's important to do, and you can see this in places like Hungary, where Viktor Orban has been in control for a long time, but the depth of the corruption that he's been involved in and the fact that public services are getting worse and worse in Hungary, despite the fact that he's had 15 years of uninterrupted power, that is now beginning to erode his power base. Of course, he's going to throw the book next year when there is an election campaign, which at the moment he's favourite not to win. The question you have to watch out for is, in the United States in particular, is the institutions. The courts appear to be very soft. For a lot of people in the United States, there was this rather mirage-like belief in the institutions being so strong and so solid. In fact, a lot of the United States problem is precisely in their institutions, starting with the system of the Electoral College, but also the fact that if you want to, and if you've got the chutzpah to do it, you can pack the Supreme Court. And hey, guess what happened? The Supreme Court has been packed. And the judiciary is so important, and clearly the judiciary is not enough at the moment. The use of the executive order, the centralization of power over the last 120 years by the president in the United States is a big problem. It is a supreme irony that Trump's original constituency, the MAGA movement, are all about increasing state rights at the expense of power in Washington. And yet Trump has presided over the most dramatic centralization of power that the United States has ever witnessed. So that executive order issue is a really, really critical one. But successive presidents have overreached the power that I think the founding fathers originally intended them to have. So you've got institutional problems in the United States, but also you have a lot of resistance. His victory in the election was a narrow victory, and you have got really energetic political characters coming through, like Mamdani, like we've already seen with AOC and so on. Now, obviously, the Democratic Party's got to get its head sorted out, but if Trump does not start closing down institutions really systematically before the midterms of next year, by which time the impact of his big, beautiful bill will start to be being felt on a lot of his supporters, then it is conceivable that the midterms could really turn things around. The worrying thing is how far is Trump prepared to go in terms of closing down democratic institutions? And at the moment, it's too early to say, although it's a real possibility and shouldn't be underestimated. So it's really a question of mobilization and organizing more effectively than the Democrats have been able to do over the past 30 years or so. So that's, it's over to the American people.
Of which I'm now one, so good luck to us. Misha Glenny, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by Maria Repnikova and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Thank you so much, Misha.
You're welcome.